In the scorching heat of Afghanistan's Helmand province, a single question would transform an ordinary weapons technician into a legend. When Ranger Captain Mike Sullivan walked into the armory tent that dusty morning in 2012, he had no idea he was about to ask something that would rewrite the history books on long-range shooting. The question seemed simple enough. Can you make a shot at 3,820 meters? What followed was not just a test of equipment and skill, but a journey that would push the boundaries of what humans thought possible with a rifle, a scope, and steady hands. Staff Sergeant David Chun never imagined that his meticulous nature with numbers and mechanical precision would make him famous. For 3 years, he had been the go-to weapons technician at Forward Operating Base Chapman, nestled in the unforgiving terrain of eastern Afghanistan. While other soldiers dreamed of heroic firefights and dramatic rescues, David found his purpose in the quiet precision of maintaining, calibrating, and perfecting the tools that kept his fellow soldiers alive. The morning of September 15, 2012, began like any other. David was already at his workbench by 0500 hours, the first light of dawn barely creeping over the mountain ridges that surrounded their base. The armory was a sanctuary, a place where chaos gave way to order, where every bolt, spring, and scope adjustment had its proper place and purpose. The familiar smell of gun oil and metal cleaner filled the air as he methodically worked through his daily equipment checks. David had always been different from the other soldiers. While they swapped stories of home or complained about the heat, he lost himself in ballistics charts and trajectory calculations. His fellow soldiers often joked that he could probably tell them the exact grain weight of a bullet just by holding it, and they weren't entirely wrong. This obsessive attention to detail had made him indispensable to every unit that had rotated through Chapman. The base itself was a study in controlled chaos. Situated in a valley surrounded by towering peaks, it served as a critical supply and operations hub for coalition forces operating in the region. Helicopters came and went with rhythmic precision, their rotors churning up clouds of fine dust that seemed to coat everything within minutes of cleaning. The constant backdrop of activity, vehicles rumbling past, generators humming, and the distant sound of training exercises had become white noise to David's focused mind. As he worked that morning, David was completely absorbed in rebuilding a sniper rifle's trigger mechanism. The M2010 enhanced sniper rifle lay partially disassembled before him, each component laid out with surgical precision. This particular rifle had been giving Sergeant Martinez trouble with inconsistent trigger pull weights, and David was determined to solve the problem. He had already spent 2 hours the previous evening studying the technical manual and consulting online forums during his brief internet time. The rifle itself was a work of art, at least in David's eyes. The M2010 represented the pinnacle of American military sniper technology, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, and capable of engaging targets at distances that would have seemed impossible to previous generations of soldiers. Every aspect of its design spoke to David's appreciation for engineering excellence, from the precisely machined receiver to the sophisticated scope mounting system. At exactly 0730 hours, the armory tent flap opened with a sharp snap that broke David's concentration. He looked up to see Captain Mike Sullivan, the leader of the base's Ranger reconnaissance team, striding through the entrance with his characteristic purposeful gait. Sullivan was a legend among the soldiers at Chapman, a man whose reputation for impossible missions and miraculous survivals had earned him respect that bordered on reverence. Sullivan was not particularly tall or imposing physically, but there was something about his presence that commanded immediate attention. His uniform was always immaculate despite the harsh conditions, and his eyes held the kind of intense focus that came from years of life-or-death decision-making. When Sullivan entered a room, conversation stopped, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect for a man who had proven himself countless times in the most dangerous situations imaginable. "Morning, Chun," Sullivan said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a born leader. "Got a minute to talk?" David immediately set down his tools and turned to face the captain. In the 3 years he had been at Chapman, Sullivan had never personally sought him out. Their interactions had been limited to brief encounters during equipment inspections or the occasional nod in passing. The fact that the legendary ranger was standing in his armory asking for his time sent a small thrill of nervous energy through David's system. "Of course, sir. What can I do for you?" Sullivan moved closer to the workbench, his eyes scanning the precisely organized tools and partially disassembled rifle with obvious appreciation. David had heard that Sullivan had started his military career as an enlisted soldier before earning his commission, and it showed in the way he examined the technical work with genuine understanding rather than detached officer curiosity. "I've been hearing interesting things about your work," Sullivan began, picking up one of David's handwritten ballistics calculation sheets. The page was covered in David's neat handwriting, showing wind drift calculations, bullet drop charts, and atmosphere pressure corrections. "Word is you can make these rifles shoot better than the factory intended." David felt a flush of pride, mixed with modesty. He had indeed developed a reputation for being able to squeeze every bit of accuracy out of the weapons systems he maintained. His secret was not any revolutionary technique, but rather an almost obsessive attention to detail that most people simply didn't have the patience for. He would spend hours adjusting trigger mechanisms to precise specifications, ensuring that scope mounts were perfectly aligned, and even hand-loading ammunition when standard military rounds weren't performing to his exacting standards. "I just try to maintain them properly, sir. Most of these rifles are capable of much better performance than people realize. It's just a matter of taking the time to do things right." Sullivan nodded, setting the calculation sheet back down with careful precision. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. I've got a situation that requires some very specialized capabilities, and I think you might be exactly the person I need to talk to." The way Sullivan said situation made David's pulse quicken slightly. In their world, situations usually meant someone's life was hanging in the balance, and the solutions required pushing equipment and personnel to their absolute limits. David had always wondered what it would be like to be directly involved in one of these critical missions rather than just preparing the tools that others would use. Sullivan walked over to the tactical map that hung on one wall of the armory tent. The map showed the surrounding terrain in intricate detail, with elevation markers, known enemy positions, and coalition patrol routes marked in different colored pins and string. David had studied this map countless times during quiet moments, using it to better understand the challenges his weapons would face in the field. "We've got intelligence on a high-value target," Sullivan continued, pointing to a location on the map that seemed impossibly far from their base. "This individual has been coordinating attacks against coalition forces for the better part of 6 months. Every time we get close, he disappears into terrain that's practically impossible for conventional assault." David moved closer to examine the location Sullivan was indicating. The target area was situated on a mountainous ridge that offered commanding views of several key valley routes. The elevation markers showed it was significantly higher than their base, and the terrain between their position and the target looked like a nightmare of exposed approaches and defensive advantages for anyone occupying the high ground. "The problem," Sullivan continued, "is that conventional approaches won't work. The terrain gives him too many escape routes, and by the time we could get a team in position for a standard operation, he'd be long gone. But there's one possibility we haven't explored." Sullivan paused, studying David's face with the kind of intense scrutiny that made him feel like he was being evaluated for something far beyond his normal duties. The silence stretched for several seconds before Sullivan finally continued. "There's an observation post about 12 kilometers north of here that offers a clear line of sight to the target area. The distance is significant. We're talking about 3,820 meters, but the geography makes it the only viable approach." David felt his breath catch slightly. 3,820 meters was well beyond the effective range of standard military sniper rifles. While the M2010 was certainly capable of sending a bullet that distance, actually hitting a human-sized target at such extreme range would require perfect conditions, exceptional skill, and perhaps more than a little luck. The technical challenges alone were staggering. "Sir, that's..." David began, then paused to choose his words carefully. That's an extremely long shot. The ballistics calculations alone would be incredibly complex. Wind conditions, atmospheric pressure, temperature variations, there are so many variables that could affect bullet trajectory at that distance. Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but David caught a slight nod that suggested the captain had expected exactly this response. I know it's pushing the envelope, Sean. That's why I'm here talking to you instead of going through normal channels. I need someone who understands these systems at a level beyond what the manual teaches. The implications of what Sullivan was suggesting began to sink in for David. This wasn't just about equipment maintenance or theoretical ballistics calculations. The captain was essentially asking him to attempt something that existed at the very edge of what was technically possible with current technology and human capability. Have you considered using one of the dedicated sniper teams, sir? Sergeant Rodriguez has been making shots out to 1,200 meters consistently, and he's got years of field experience. Sullivan shook his head slowly. Rodriguez is good, no question about it. But this isn't just about marksmanship. This is about understanding every technical aspect of the equipment and being able to compensate for factors that most shooters never have to consider. From what I've observed, you think about these weapons systems in ways that other people don't. The compliment was flattering, but David also recognized the enormous responsibility that Sullivan was placing on his shoulders. If he accepted this challenge and failed, it wouldn't just be a missed shot. It would be a missed opportunity to eliminate a threat that had been responsible for American casualties. The weight of that potential failure was almost overwhelming. What kind of time frame are we looking at, sir? The intelligence suggests he'll be at this location tomorrow evening, probably around 1900 hours. That gives us roughly 36 hours to plan, prepare, and position for the shot. 36 hours to plan something that would normally require weeks of preparation and testing. David's mind immediately began racing through the technical challenges they would face. Wind patterns at that distance and elevation difference would be critical. Atmospheric conditions would need to be perfect. The rifle would need to be zeroed specifically for that distance and altitude. Even the ammunition would need to be carefully selected and possibly modified for optimal performance. Sir, I have to be honest with you. A shot like this, under field conditions, with limited preparation time, the probability of success is not high. There are too many variables that we won't be able to control or accurately predict. Sullivan's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since entering the armory, he seemed less like the legendary Ranger captain and more like a fellow soldier sharing a difficult burden. I know the odds aren't good, Sean, but sometimes impossible odds are all we have to work with. This target has cost us too many good soldiers, and conventional approaches just aren't viable. David looked again at the map, studying the terrain between their base and the target location. The observation post Sullivan had mentioned was indeed positioned with a clear line of sight, but the technical challenges remained daunting. Still, as he examined the ballistics requirements, a part of his mind was already beginning to work through potential solutions. If I were to attempt this, David said carefully, I would need complete control over equipment selection, ammunition preparation, and positioning logistics. And I would need at least one other person who understands the technical aspects to assist with calculations and observations. Sullivan nodded immediately. Done. Whatever you need, you'll have it. Personnel, equipment, transportation. Just tell me what's required. The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. David had spent years working behind the scenes, supporting other people's missions with his technical expertise. The opportunity to directly apply that knowledge in a critical situation was something he had never dared to hope for. At the same time, the stakes could not be higher. I'll need to study the terrain data more carefully and run some preliminary calculations, David said finally. Can you give me until this afternoon to assess whether it's technically feasible? Absolutely. Take whatever time you need to make sure you're comfortable with the approach. As Sullivan turned to leave, he paused at the tent entrance and looked back at David. One more thing, Chun. If you decide this is something you can do, I want you to know that I have complete confidence in your abilities. You wouldn't be my first choice for this mission if I didn't believe you were the best person for the job. With that, Sullivan stepped out of the armory, leaving David alone with his thoughts and the enormous weight of the decision he faced. The partially disassembled rifle on his workbench suddenly seemed to represent far more than just another maintenance task. It was a tool that might soon be asked to perform at the very limits of its design capabilities. David sat down at his workbench and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. At the top, he wrote 3,820 meters and began to work through the fundamental ballistics equations that would govern such an extreme shot. As the numbers began to fill the page, he felt the familiar sense of calm that came from losing himself in technical problems. Whatever decision he ultimately made, it would be based on solid mathematics and careful analysis rather than emotion or ego. The question Captain Sullivan had posed that morning would indeed change everything. But as David worked through his calculations, he had no idea just how dramatically his life was about to be transformed. David spent the next 4 hours completely absorbed in calculations that would have seemed like abstract mathematics to most people, but represented the difference between success and failure in the most literal sense. The sheet of paper that had started with just 3,820 meters at the top had grown into a complex web of numbers, equations, and diagrams that covered every aspect of extreme long-range ballistics. The fundamental challenge was immediately apparent. At nearly 2.4 miles, the bullet would be in flight for over 4 seconds, during which time it would be subject to gravitational drop, wind drift, atmospheric pressure variations, temperature effects, and even the Coriolis effect from Earth's rotation. Each of these factors alone could cause a miss at such extreme range, and when combined, they created a nearly impossible targeting problem. David started with the basic trajectory calculations. Using the ballistic coefficient of the .300 Winchester Magnum ammunition and the known muzzle velocity of the M2010 rifle, he calculated that the bullet would drop approximately 1,200 inches, over 100 feet, by the time it reached the target. This meant the rifle would need to be aimed at a point in empty sky that seemed impossibly high above the actual target. But bullet drop was just the beginning. Wind effects at that distance would be catastrophic if not properly calculated. Even a gentle 5-mile-per-hour crosswind would push the bullet nearly 20 feet off target. The problem was complicated by the fact that wind conditions would certainly vary along the bullet's path, particularly given the mountainous terrain and elevation changes involved. As David worked through the numbers, he began to appreciate the true magnitude of what Captain Sullivan was asking him to attempt. This wasn't just an extremely difficult shot. It was a shot that pushed beyond the tested limits of the equipment and into territory where theoretical calculations would have to substitute for practical experience. Around noon, David was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, the base's senior communications specialist. Rodriguez was known throughout Chapman for her ability to solve complex technical problems, and David suspected that Sullivan had sent her as the assistant he had requested. "Heard you're working on something interesting," Rodriguez said, settling into a chair beside David's workbench. She glanced at the calculation sheets with obvious curiosity. "Captain Sullivan said you might need someone who's good with numbers and technical analysis." David felt a wave of relief. Rodriguez had a reputation for methodical thinking and attention to detail that nearly matched his own. More importantly, she had extensive experience with the kind of precision equipment that would be essential for a shot like this. "I'm trying to figure out if it's even possible to make an accurate shot at 3,820 meters, David explained, showing her his calculations. "The ballistics are manageable in theory, but there's so many variables that I can't accurately predict from here." Rodriguez studied the numbers with the kind of focused attention that David recognized in fellow technical specialists. She traced through his trajectory calculations with her finger, occasionally nodding or making small notations in the margins. "Your basic ballistics look solid," she said finally. "But you're right about the variables. Wind is going to be the killer. At that distance, even small variations in wind speed or direction along the bullet path could cause huge deviations." She paused, studying the topographical map that David had spread out beside his calculations. "What about using weather monitoring equipment to get real-time atmospheric data along the probable bullet path. David looked up from his calculations with renewed interest. What kind of equipment are you thinking about? We've got portable weather stations that can transmit wind speed, direction, temperature, and barometric pressure data in real time. If we could position several of them along the line of sight, we might be able to get a much better picture of conditions. The suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to estimate atmospheric conditions across nearly 4 kilometers of varied terrain, they could actually measure them at multiple points and interpolate the data to create a more accurate picture of what the bullet would encounter in flight. How many stations could we deploy, and how quickly could we get them in position? Rodriguez pulled out a small notebook and began sketching a rough deployment plan. I think we could reasonably position 4 or 5 stations along the line of sight. 2 or 3 could be placed by helicopter this afternoon, and the others could be carried to position by foot patrols tonight. David felt the first genuine surge of optimism since Sullivan had presented him with the challenge. With real-time atmospheric data, the shot would still be extremely difficult, but it would move from the realm of pure guesswork into something that could be calculated with reasonable precision. There's another factor we need to consider, David said, returning to his calculations. The Coriolis effect. At this distance and latitude, Earth's rotation is going to deflect the bullet several inches to the right. Rodriguez nodded. I was wondering if you'd account for that. Most people don't realize that at extreme distances, you're literally shooting at a moving target because the Earth is rotating underneath the bullet's path. The Coriolis effect was one of those factors that sounded like science fiction to most people, but was a very real consideration for extreme long-range shooting. At their latitude and the distance involved, the bullet would be deflected approximately 8 inches to the right by the time it reached the target. It seemed like a small amount, but at ranges where precision was measured in inches, it could easily mean the difference between a hit and a complete miss. As the afternoon wore on, David and Rodriguez worked through every technical aspect they could think of. They calculated ammunition performance at altitude, scope adjustment requirements, and even the effects of rifle barrel temperature on muzzle velocity. Each factor they identified and quantified moved them slightly closer to a solution that might actually work. Around 1,500 hours, Captain Sullivan returned to the armory to check on their progress. David noticed that the captain looked more tense than he had that morning, suggesting that intelligence about their target might have become more urgent. How are we looking, Chun? David spread out his calculation sheets and the deployment plan Rodriguez had developed for the weather monitoring stations. Sir, it's going to be extremely challenging, but I think it might be technically feasible. The key is getting accurate real-time atmospheric data along the bullet path. Sullivan studied their work with obvious interest. Despite his reputation as a tactical leader, David could see that the captain had enough technical background to understand the complexity of what they were proposing. What kind of success probability are we talking about? David exchanged a glance with Rodriguez before answering. Sir, under ideal conditions, with perfect weather data and no equipment malfunctions, I'd estimate maybe a 30 to 40% chance of a first-round hit. That's assuming the target remains stationary and visible for the entire engagement. The probability was sobering, but Sullivan nodded as if he had expected something in that range. What would improve those odds? Multiple shots, if the tactical situation allows for it, Rodriguez interjected. The first shot gives us real-world data about how our calculations match actual conditions. A second shot could be adjusted based on observed impact. Time is going to be critical, David added. We need to position all the monitoring equipment, zero the rifle at the longest possible range we can manage here at the base, and conduct final ballistic calculations based on actual conditions tomorrow evening. Sullivan studied the topographical map, tracing the line of sight from their proposed shooting position to the target area. The observation post where you'd be shooting from is accessible by vehicle most of the way, then about a kilometer hike. How much equipment are we talking about? David made a mental inventory of everything they would need. The rifle and optics, obviously. About 200 rounds of carefully selected ammunition. The ballistic computer and range-finding equipment. Weather monitoring gear. and probably a spotting scope for Rodriguez to help with target identification and impact observation. Weight won't be a problem. I can arrange for the gear to be pre-positioned at the observation post tonight. Sullivan paused, studying David's face intently. I need to ask you directly, Chun. Based on everything you've calculated and planned, do you believe you can make this shot? The question hung in the air between them for several seconds. David realized that this was the moment of commitment, not just to attempting the shot, but to taking responsibility for its success or failure. Everything he had worked for and trained on over the past 3 years had led to this single question. Sir, I believe the technical approach is sound. The equipment is capable of the accuracy we need. The atmospheric monitoring will give us the data necessary for precise calculations. David paused, choosing his final words carefully. I can't guarantee success, but I can guarantee that if this shot is technically possible, we're giving it the best chance we can. Sullivan nodded slowly. That's all anyone can ask for. Let's make it happen. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation activity. Rodriguez coordinated with helicopter crews to position the weather monitoring stations along the calculated bullet path. David spent time in the armory carefully examining and selecting ammunition, looking for rounds that matched as closely as possible in weight, powder charge, and overall dimensions. The ammunition selection process was more complex than most people realized. Even factory-manufactured military ammunition could vary slightly from round to round, and at extreme distances, these small variations could translate into significant accuracy differences. David used precision scales to weigh each bullet and cartridge case, selecting only those rounds that fell within the tightest possible tolerances. He also spent considerable time examining the M2010 rifle that would be used for the shot. This particular weapon had been modified slightly from standard configuration, with a custom trigger that David had adjusted to break at exactly 2.5 pounds with minimal overtravel. The scope mounts had been precisely aligned using laser equipment, and the barrel had been carefully cleaned and inspected for any signs of wear or fouling that might affect accuracy. As evening approached, David found himself facing the strange combination of confidence and anxiety that came with major technical challenges. The mathematics all worked out correctly, the equipment was performing to specification, and they had developed a systematic approach to gathering the atmosphere data they would need. But mathematics and equipment could only take them so far. Ultimately, success would depend on human judgment and skill applied under extreme pressure. Rodriguez had spent the afternoon coordinating the weather station deployment and testing the data transmission systems. The stations were positioned approximately every 800 meters along the line of sight, providing coverage of the most critical portions of the bullet's path. Each station was transmitting wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure data every 30 seconds. The weather data looks good, Rodriguez reported as she reviewed the incoming information. Wind patterns are relatively stable, though there are some variations in the mountain valleys that we'll need to account for in the calculations. David studied the data streaming in from the weather stations. The wind information was particularly encouraging. Conditions were generally light and consistent, with only minor variations that could be incorporated into their ballistic calculations. Temperature and pressure readings were also within normal ranges for the altitude and time of year. That evening, David lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling of the tent he shared with 3 other soldiers. His mind kept running through the technical aspects of the shot, double-checking calculations, and visualizing the sequence of events that would unfold the following evening. Sleep seemed impossible with so much riding on the precision of his preparation. Around midnight, he gave up trying to sleep and returned to the armory. Working by the light of a single desk lamp, he went through his calculations one more time, checking and rechecking every number. The mathematics remained consistent. The shot was theoretically possible, though it would require near-perfect execution. As he worked, David reflected on the strange path that had led him to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been just another technician, focused on maintaining equipment and staying out of the way of more glamorous military specialties. Now he was being asked to attempt something that would push the boundaries of what was considered possible with small arms. The responsibility was almost overwhelming, but David also recognized that this represented everything he had been working toward throughout his military career. All those hours spent studying ballistics manuals, all the time devoted to perfecting equipment maintenance procedures, all the attention to detail that others sometimes found obsessive. It all led to this single opportunity to apply his specialized knowledge in service of a critical mission. Dawn was beginning to break over the mountains when David finally returned to his bunk. In 12 hours, he would be in position to attempt the longest confirmed military sniper shot in history. The mathematics supported the possibility of success. The equipment was prepared to optimal standards, and atmospheric conditions appeared favorable. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, David knew that when the moment came, all the calculations and preparation in the world would ultimately depend on his ability to control his breathing, steady his hands, and execute a perfect trigger pull at exactly the right moment. The shot that Captain Sullivan had asked him about was indeed impossible, right up until the moment when it wasn't. The morning of September 16th, 2012, dawned with the kind of crystal-clear sky that meteorologists called severe clear, not a cloud visible anywhere, with visibility extending to the horizon in every direction. David woke before his alarm, his internal clock precisely tuned to the importance of the day ahead. As he dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, every movement felt deliberate and significant, as if he were preparing for something far beyond a normal military operation. By 0600 hours, David was back in the armory conducting final equipment checks. The M2010 rifle lay on his workbench, every component cleaned, inspected, and verified to be functioning perfectly. Beside it sat 200 rounds of carefully selected .300 Winchester Magnum ammunition, each cartridge chosen for its precise weight and dimensional consistency. The ballistic computer, range-finding equipment, and weather monitoring gear were packed in protective cases designed to withstand the helicopter transport and subsequent overland movement to the observation post. Rodriguez arrived shortly after David, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and looking as focused as he felt. Over the past 18 hours, she had become an essential partner in what had started as David's individual challenge. Her expertise with communications and data analysis had transformed their approach from educated guesswork into something resembling precision science. Weather stations are still transmitting normally, she reported, setting her coffee down and activating the data monitoring equipment. Conditions along the bullet path look very stable. Wind speeds are averaging between 3 and 7 miles per hour, mostly from the southwest. Temperature gradients are minimal. David felt a surge of cautious optimism. Weather was the one factor they could monitor but not control, and favorable atmospheric conditions would be critical to success at such extreme range. The data Rodriguez was receiving suggested that they would have about as good conditions as could be reasonably hoped for. Any word from Captain Sullivan about the target's movements? He's scheduled to brief us at 0800, but preliminary intelligence suggests the target is following his expected pattern. Should be in position this evening, right on schedule. The next 2 hours passed quickly as David and Rodriguez completed their final preparations. They verified that all communications equipment was functioning properly, ran through their coordination procedures, and conducted final checks of the ballistic calculations based on the most current weather data. Every aspect of their plan had been rehearsed multiple times, but David knew that actual field conditions would inevitably present challenges they hadn't anticipated. At exactly 0800 hours, Captain Sullivan entered the armory accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel James McKenzie, the base commander. David had seen McKenzie around the base, but had never spoken with him directly. The colonel's presence suggested that word of their mission had reached the highest levels of command, adding another layer of pressure to an already intense situation. "Gentlemen," McKenzie said without preamble, "I've been briefed on what you're attempting today. I want you to know that you have my complete support, and more importantly, you have the confidence of everyone in this chain of command." The colonel's words were reassuring, but David also detected an undertone of caution that suggested Mackenzie understood exactly how difficult their task would be. This wasn't just about making a long shot. It was about attempting something that existed at the very edge of technical possibility. "Sir, we've done everything we can to prepare," David replied. "The ballistics calculations are solid. We have real-time atmospheric data, and the equipment is performing to specification. But I want to be clear that success is not guaranteed. There are too many variables involved for anyone to make that kind of promise." Mackenzie nodded approvingly. "I appreciate your honesty, Sergeant Chen. What I can tell you is that the intelligence value of this target justifies the risk and effort involved. If anyone can make this shot, it's the team you've assembled." Sullivan stepped forward with a detailed topographical map showing their route to the observation post. "We'll be departing the base at 1,400 hours by helicopter. Flight time to the insertion point is approximately 20 minutes, followed by a 1-kilometer overland movement to the shooting position. We'll have the area secured well before the target's expected arrival time." David studied the route, noting the elevation changes and terrain features they would encounter. The observation post was situated on a rocky outcropping that offered an unobstructed view of the target area while providing excellent concealment for the shooting team. More importantly, the position was at nearly the same elevation as their target, which would simplify the ballistic calculations by minimizing the effects of shooting at a steep angle. "What's the timeline for target engagement, sir?" "Intelligence suggests he'll arrive at the target location between 1830 and 1900 hours. Weather forecasts indicate that atmospheric conditions should remain stable through the evening, which works in our favor." Rodriguez looked up from her weather monitoring equipment. "Sir, based on the data we're receiving, optimal shooting conditions will probably occur around 1845 hours. That's when wind speeds are forecast to be at their minimum, and temperature gradients will be most stable." The precision of Rodriguez's forecast impressed David. Over the past day, she had become remarkably skilled at interpreting the complex atmospheric data they were collecting. Her ability to predict optimal shooting conditions could make the difference between success and failure. "Outstanding," Sullivan said. "That gives us a tight window, but it's workable. Chun, how long do you need to get the rifle zeroed and ready once we reach the observation post?" David had thought carefully about this question. Normally, zeroing a rifle for extreme long-range shooting would require multiple test shots at increasing distances, a luxury they wouldn't have in a tactical situation. Instead, they would have to rely on his mathematical calculations and hope that the rifle's mechanical zero matched their theoretical requirements. "Sir, I'll need about 30 minutes to set up the shooting position and make final scope adjustments based on the most current atmospheric data. After that, we'll be ready to engage as soon as the target presents itself." The briefing concluded with a detailed review of communication procedures and contingency plans. David would be the primary shooter, with Rodriguez serving as spotter and ballistic calculator. Sullivan would maintain overall tactical control of the operation, with backup teams positioned to provide security and emergency extraction if needed. As the others left to complete their own preparations, David found himself alone in the armory with his thoughts. In 6 hours, he would be attempting something that most people considered impossible. The technical preparation had been thorough, but success would ultimately depend on his ability to execute under pressure that he had never experienced before. The helicopter flight to the insertion point passed without incident, though David found himself constantly reviewing his ballistic calculations and visualizing the sequence of events that would unfold once they reached the observation post. The landscape below them was a study in harsh beauty, rocky peaks, deep valleys, and sparse vegetation that spoke to the challenging environment where American forces had been operating for over a decade. As they approached the landing zone, David could see the observation post in the distance, a carefully camouflaged position that blended seamlessly with the surrounding rock formations. The strategic value of the location was immediately apparent. It offered commanding views of several key terrain features while remaining virtually invisible to anyone in the target area. The helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and noise, disgorging David, Rodriguez, Sullivan, and 2 additional security personnel before immediately lifting off again. Within minutes, the sound of rotors had faded into the distance, leaving them alone in the mountain wilderness with their equipment and their mission. The 1-kilometer movement to the observation post took nearly 40 minutes, not because of the distance, but because of the care required to move their sensitive equipment over rough terrain without damaging it. David personally carried the M2010 rifle, treating it like the precision instrument it was. Rodriguez managed the ballistic computer and communications gear, while the security personnel handled the heavier items like ammunition and shelter materials. The observation post itself was a masterpiece of military engineering, carved into a natural rock formation that provided both concealment and protection. Previous teams had improved the position over time, adding communication equipment, weather monitoring instruments, and carefully constructed firing positions that offered stable platforms for precision shooting. As soon as they reached the post, David began the process of setting up his shooting position. The first step was to establish a stable firing platform using a bipod and rear sandbag that would eliminate any movement or vibration during the shot. Every detail mattered at extreme range. Even small inconsistencies in rifle positioning could translate into significant accuracy problems at 3,820 meters. Rodriguez immediately began collecting and analyzing atmospheric data from their network of weather monitoring stations. The information was encouraging. Wind conditions remained light and consistent, with only minor variations along the bullet path. Temperature and humidity readings were within the ranges they had used for their ballistic calculations. Atmospheric conditions look excellent, Rodriguez reported as she updated their ballistic computer with the most current data. Wind averaging 4 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure steady at 29.85 inches of mercury. David felt a surge of confidence as he made final adjustments to his rifle scope. The numbers Rodriguez was providing matched almost exactly with the conditions they had used for their theoretical calculations. If atmospheric factors remained stable for the next hour, they would have nearly ideal shooting conditions. At 18:20 hours, Sullivan received confirmation through his communications equipment that their target had arrived at the expected location and was moving according to the predicted pattern. David felt his heart rate increase slightly as the moment of truth approached. All their preparation and calculation was about to be put to the ultimate test. Through his spotting scope, Rodriguez confirmed visual contact with the target area. "I have eyes on the location. No visual on the target yet, but I can see movement in the general area." David settled into his shooting position, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle against his shoulder. The scope crosshairs were precisely aligned with a reference point near the target location, adjusted for the calculated bullet drop, wind drift, and all the other factors they had so carefully computed. At this distance, the scope was aimed at what appeared to be empty sky, trusting mathematics to guide the bullet to its intended destination. "Wind check," David called softly. Rodriguez consulted her instruments. "Wind 4 miles per hour, southwest. No change from previous readings." Atmospheric conditions remained stable. David took a deep breath and began the final phase of his shooting preparation. His breathing slowed to a controlled rhythm, his heart rate settled, and his entire focus narrowed to the precise mechanics of making a perfect shot. Everything he had learned and practiced over 3 years of military service had led to this single moment. Through his scope, the target area looked impossibly distant, a tiny patch of terrain visible only because of the powerful magnification of his optics. David knew that at this range, the target would appear as little more than a small dot, requiring absolute precision in both aim and timing. "Target acquisition," Rodriguez called out quietly. "I have visual confirmation. Individual is stationary. Range confirmed at 3,820 meters." David made a final tiny adjustment to his scope, accounting for the most current wind data Rodriguez had provided. His finger found the trigger, applying the precise 2.5 pounds of pressure needed to fire the rifle while maintaining perfect sight alignment. The moment had arrived. 3 years of preparation, 24 hours of intensive calculation and planning, and a day of movement and positioning had led to this single instant. David's world narrowed to nothing but crosshairs, breath control, and the gentle pressure of his finger against the trigger. The impossible shot was about to become reality. Time seemed to slow as David's finger applied the final ounce of pressure to the trigger. In that suspended moment before the shot, his entire world consisted of nothing but the crosshairs perfectly aligned in his scope, his controlled breathing, and the absolute stillness required for precision shooting. Every calculation, every hour of preparation, every technical detail they had obsessed over for the past 24 hours had led to this single instant of truth. The M2010 rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding mountain walls, the sound seeming almost anticlimactic given the magnitude of what they were attempting. David felt the familiar recoil against his shoulder, but his focus remained locked on maintaining perfect sight picture through the scope. At this distance, the bullet would be in flight for over 4 seconds, an eternity in the world of precision shooting. Rodriguez immediately began tracking time on her stopwatch while simultaneously monitoring the ballistic computer display. "Shot fired. Time mark," she called out in a calm, professional voice that belied the tension of the moment. "Flight time approximately 4.2 seconds. David held his firing position, maintaining sight alignment and waiting for Rodriguez to call the impact. At 3,820 meters, observing bullet impact would be challenging even with their high-powered spotting scope, particularly if the shot missed the immediate target area. The waiting seemed to stretch forever, though David knew that barely seconds had passed since pulling the trigger. "Impact observed," Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying a note of excitement that she quickly controlled. "I see dust signature approximately 2 meters left and 1 meter low of target." David felt a surge of both disappointment and elation. The shot had missed, but only barely. At nearly 2.4 miles distance, being off by just 3 meters represented remarkable accuracy. More importantly, the near miss told them that their ballistic calculations were fundamentally correct and that a successful shot was definitely within reach. "Outstanding," Sullivan said quietly through their communication system. "That's close enough to make adjustments. Can you compensate for the observed deviation?" David was already making scope corrections based on Rodriguez's impact observation. At this extreme range, even small adjustments translated into significant point of impact changes. He carefully dialed in corrections for the observed left and low impact, while Rodriguez updated their ballistic calculations based on the real-world data they had just collected. "Rodriguez, any change in atmospheric conditions?" She consulted her instruments quickly. "Negative. Wind remains steady at 4 miles per hour southwest. Temperature and pressure unchanged. Conditions are stable." Through their communications equipment, they received confirmation that their target remained in the area and, apparently unaware that he was under observation from such an extreme distance. The first shot had been virtually silent at the target location, with the supersonic crack of the bullet's passage being the only indication that someone was shooting in their general direction. David settled back into his firing position, feeling more confident now that he had real-world confirmation of their ballistic calculations. The scope corrections he had made should compensate for the observed deviation, assuming atmospheric conditions remained stable. His breathing returned to the controlled rhythm that was essential for precision shooting, and his focus narrowed once again to the technical perfection required for success. "Target remains stationary," Rodriguez reported. "I have continuous visual confirmation. Range unchanged at 3,820 meters." David's finger found the trigger for the second time, applying the same precise pressure that had become automatic through years of training. This time, he felt even more confident in the shot, knowing that their calculations had been validated by real-world performance. The mathematical precision that had governed their entire approach was about to be tested once more. The rifle fired again, the sharp report echoing across the mountainous terrain. David maintained his sight picture, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether their mission was successful. Rodriguez began her stopwatch routine again, tracking the bullet's flight time while simultaneously watching through her spotting scope for impact observation. "Flight time mark," Rodriguez called out, her voice betraying none of the tension they both felt. The seconds stretched out like hours as they waited for the bullet to complete its long journey across nearly 2.5 miles of mountainous terrain. "Impact observed," Rodriguez announced, and this time her voice carried a note of amazement that she couldn't entirely suppress. "Direct hit. Target is down." "Repeat, target is down." David felt a wave of emotions that he couldn't immediately process. Relief, pride, amazement, and a profound sense of accomplishment that came from achieving something he had thought might be impossible just 24 hours earlier. Through his scope, he could see the target area, though the individual details were impossible to discern at such extreme range. "Confirm target down." Sullivan's voice came through their communications system with obvious satisfaction. "Outstanding work, both of you. Mission accomplished." The confirmation from Sullivan made it real in a way that David's own observations couldn't. They had actually done it, made a successful shot at 3,820 meters under field conditions, achieving something that existed at the very edge of what was considered technically possible with current military equipment. Rodriguez was busy recording all the technical details of the successful shot: atmospheric conditions, scope settings, ammunition lot numbers, and every other factor that might be relevant for future reference. Her systematic approach to data collection was already thinking ahead to how their success might be replicated or improved upon in future operations. "David," Rodriguez said, using his first name for the first time since they had begun working together, "do you realize what we just accomplished? That's the longest confirmed military sniper shot on record. We just made history." The magnitude of their achievement was beginning to sink in for David. When Captain Sullivan had first asked him about making an impossible shot, he had focused entirely on the technical challenges involved. The possibility that they were attempting something that would enter the history books hadn't really occurred to him until this moment. "It wasn't just me," David replied, his voice reflecting the exhaustion and relief he felt. "This was a team effort. Your atmospheric data and ballistic calculations made the difference between success and failure." Sullivan's voice came through their communications system again. "Confirmed elimination of high-value target. Intelligence assessment indicates significant disruption to enemy operations in this sector. You've both done exceptional work." The intelligence confirmation added another dimension to their success. This hadn't just been a remarkable demonstration of marksmanship and technical precision. It had been a mission that would directly impact the safety of American forces operating in the region. The target they had eliminated had been responsible for coordinating attacks that had cost American lives, and his removal would degrade enemy capabilities significantly. As they began the process of packing up their equipment for the return journey to base, David found himself reflecting on the strange combination of factors that had made their success possible. Technical expertise and mathematical precision had been essential, but they had also benefited from nearly perfect atmospheric conditions and equipment that performed flawlessly under extreme stress. "Rodriguez, how accurate were our ballistic calculations compared to actual performance?" She consulted her notes and the ballistic computer data. "Remarkably accurate. The first shot deviation was less than 0.1% at that distance. When you consider all the variables involved, that's almost impossible precision for theoretical calculations." The accuracy of their predictions validated David's methodical approach to ballistics and equipment preparation. Every hour spent studying technical manuals, every careful measurement and calculation had contributed to achieving results that matched theoretical performance almost perfectly. The helicopter extraction went smoothly, though David found himself almost unable to believe that the mission was actually complete. Less than 6 hours earlier, he had been preparing for what seemed like an impossible shot. Now, they were returning to base, having successfully accomplished something that would be talked about for years to come. During the flight back to base, Sullivan moved forward to sit beside David and Rodriguez. "I want both of you to know that what you accomplished today goes far beyond the immediate tactical success. You've demonstrated capabilities that could change how we approach certain types of missions." The implications of Sullivan's comment were intriguing. David had been so focused on the technical challenges of making one specific shot that he hadn't considered how their methods might be applied more broadly. The systematic approach they had developed for extreme long-range shooting could indeed be adapted for other situations where conventional approaches weren't viable. "Sir, do you think there will be other opportunities to use these techniques?" Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. "I think what you've proven today is that with proper preparation and the right technical expertise, we can engage targets at distances that were previously considered impossible. That's a capability that could be extremely valuable in the right tactical situations." As they approached their base, David could see that word of their mission had somehow spread throughout the camp. Small groups of soldiers had gathered near the landing zone, and there was an air of excitement that suggested their success had become common knowledge remarkably quickly. The helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and noise, but this time the reception was very different from their departure earlier in the day. Colonel Mackenzie was waiting personally to greet them, along with several other senior officers and what appeared to be a significant portion of the base's personnel. "Sergeant Chun, Sergeant Rodriguez," Mackenzie said as they disembarked from the helicopter, "congratulations on an exceptional mission. What you accomplished today represents a remarkable achievement in military precision shooting." The formal recognition from the base commander was gratifying, but David found himself more interested in the technical implications of what they had achieved. The successful shot validated not just their specific approach, but the entire concept of using systematic ballistic analysis and real-time atmospheric data to achieve extreme long-range precision. Over the next several hours, David and Rodriguez spent considerable time debriefing with intelligence personnel, technical specialists, and senior officers who wanted to understand exactly how they had accomplished something that many people had considered impossible. The systematic documentation of their methods would ensure that their techniques could be studied, refined, and potentially replicated in future operations. That evening, as David sat in the armory cleaning and maintaining the M2010 rifle that had performed so flawlessly during their mission, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 2 days. The question Captain Sullivan had asked about making an impossible shot had led him far beyond his normal duties as a weapons technician and into territory he had never imagined exploring. Rodriguez joined him in the armory, carrying her own equipment for post-mission maintenance and storage. "David, I keep thinking about what we did today. 3 days ago, if someone had told me we were going to make a successful shot at over 2 miles, I would have said they were crazy." David nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The achievement still seemed almost surreal, despite having experienced it firsthand. The technical challenges they had overcome, the precision required for success, and the ultimate validation of their systematic approach all combined to create something that felt more like a theoretical exercise than actual field operations. "What I keep coming back to," David replied, "is how every technical detail we obsessed over actually mattered. The ammunition selection, the scope adjustments, the atmospheric monitoring, it all contributed to success in ways that we calculated but couldn't really prove until we actually took the shot." As they worked, David realized that while their mission was complete, the implications of what they had accomplished were just beginning to unfold. They had proven that with proper preparation and technical expertise, impossible shots were indeed possible. The question now was where that knowledge would lead them next. The weapons technician who had been asked about an impossible shot had become something very different over the course of just 2 days. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but David knew that he would never again be just a technician maintaining equipment for other people's missions. He had become someone who could turn the impossible into reality through mathematics, precision, and determination. 3 weeks after the record-breaking shot, David found himself sitting in a windowless conference room at Bagram Air Base, facing a panel of military officials whose ranks and specialties suggested that his achievement had attracted attention at the highest levels of command. The formal debriefing session had been scheduled to review the technical aspects of the mission, but David suspected there was more to this meeting than simple documentation of their methods. Colonel Sarah Hayes, a career intelligence officer with extensive counterterrorism experience, led the discussion. Sergeant Chun, the shot you made on September 16th has been independently verified as the longest confirmed military sniper kill in recorded history. But more importantly, from our perspective, it represents a significant advancement in our tactical capabilities. The recognition was gratifying, but David had spent the past 3 weeks thinking more about the broader implications of what he and Rodriguez had accomplished than about the record itself. Their systematic approach to extreme long-range shooting had proven that with proper preparation and technical expertise, targets could be engaged at distances previously considered impossible. Ma'am, I think what we demonstrated was that mathematical precision and real-time atmospheric data can extend effective shooting ranges far beyond what most people thought possible. The key was treating it as an engineering problem rather than just a marksmanship challenge. Major Robert Chun, a weapons systems specialist who shared David's surname, but no family relation, leaned forward with obvious interest. Walk us through the technical innovations that made success possible. Our analysis suggests you developed methodologies that could be applied much more broadly. David had anticipated this question and had prepared a comprehensive technical summary of their approach. The critical breakthrough was using multiple weather monitoring stations to create a real-time atmospheric profile along the entire bullet path. Traditional long-range shooting relies on estimating conditions, but at extreme distances, small variations become magnified into major accuracy problems. Rodriguez, who had been promoted to staff sergeant in recognition of her contributions to the mission, added her perspective on the data analysis aspects. We also developed new ballistic calculation methods that accounted for factors most shooters never have to consider: Earth's rotation, atmospheric pressure gradients, even temperature variations along the bullet's flight path. The technical discussion continued for over an hour, with the panel asking detailed questions about equipment modifications, ammunition selection criteria, and calculation methodologies. David realized that they weren't just documenting what had happened. They were evaluating whether their techniques could be systematized and taught to other personnel. Sergeant Chun, Colonel Hayes said finally, "We'd like to discuss some opportunities that have emerged as a result of your demonstrated capabilities. The Army is interested in developing a specialized program focused on extreme long-range precision shooting, and you're being considered for a leadership role in that effort." The proposal was both exciting and daunting. David had entered the military as a weapons technician with no particular aspirations beyond maintaining equipment to the highest standards. The possibility of leading a specialized program that would push the boundaries of what was possible with precision shooting represented a career path he had never imagined. "Ma'am, what kind of program are we talking about?" "A combination of technical development and operational capability. You'd work with engineers and ballistics experts to refine the methodologies you've developed, while also training selected personnel in extreme long-range shooting techniques. The goal would be to create a reliable capability for engaging high-value targets in situations where conventional approaches aren't viable." Major Chun handed David a folder containing preliminary program documentation. "We're talking about a permanent assignment to Fort Benning with access to research facilities and testing ranges that would let you develop and refine your techniques under controlled conditions. You'd also have opportunities to work with equipment manufacturers on developing specialized systems." David opened the folder and scanned through the program outline. The scope was impressive. They were proposing to create an entire specialized field focused on extreme long-range precision shooting, with David serving as both technical developer and chief instructor. The resources they were offering would allow him to pursue questions and improvements that he had been thinking about since the mission. Would Sergeant Rodriguez be involved in this program as well? Colonel Ismail, we were hoping you'd ask that question. Her expertise in atmospheric analysis and ballistic calculations would be essential to the program's success. We're prepared to offer her a parallel position focusing on the technical and training aspects of the data analysis components. The opportunity to continue working with Rodriguez was almost as appealing as the technical challenges the program would present. Their partnership during the mission had demonstrated that complex technical problems could be solved through systematic collaboration between specialists with complementary expertise. Ma'am, I'm definitely interested, but I'd like to understand more about the operational expectations. Would this be purely a training and development role, or would there be operational missions as well? Both. The program would develop standardized techniques and train personnel, but you'd also be available for missions where your specialized capabilities are required. Think of it as creating a new military specialty focused on solving tactical problems that can't be addressed through conventional means. Over the following weeks, David found himself immersed in the process of transitioning from a standard weapons technician to something entirely new in the military structure. The specialized program was approved at remarkable speed, suggesting that senior leadership recognized the strategic value of the capabilities he had demonstrated. The move to Fort Benning opened up possibilities that David had never imagined. The base's extensive testing facilities allowed him to experiment with equipment modifications, ammunition variations, and shooting techniques under controlled conditions that would let him quantify improvements systematically. For the first time, he had access to resources that matched his technical curiosity about precision shooting. Rodriguez joined him at Fort Benning 2 months later, bringing with her advanced atmospheric monitoring equipment and data analysis systems that represented significant improvements over what they had used during their record-breaking mission. Together, they began developing training curricula and operational procedures that would allow other personnel to achieve similar results. The first class of students arrived in January 2013, 6 months after their historic shot. The 12 selected soldiers represented various military specialties, but all had demonstrated exceptional marksmanship skills and technical aptitude. David found teaching to be more challenging and rewarding than he had expected. Translating his intuitive understanding of precision shooting into systematic instruction required him to think about his own methods in entirely new ways. The key concept you need to understand, David told his first class during their initial ballistics lecture, is that extreme long-range shooting is fundamentally an applied mathematics problem. Marksmanship skills are essential, but success depends on your ability to accurately measure, calculate, and compensate for all the physical factors that affect bullet flight. One student, Sergeant Maria Santos, raised her hand. "Sir, how do you develop confidence in calculations when you're dealing with distances where you can't validate your assumptions through practice shots?" It was an excellent question that got to the heart of what made extreme long-range shooting so challenging. That's where systematic preparation and equipment reliability become critical. You have to trust the mathematics because you won't get multiple chances to adjust based on trial and error. The training program evolved rapidly as David and Rodriguez learned from their students and refined their instructional methods. They developed standardized procedures for atmospheric data collection, ballistic calculation protocols, and equipment preparation checklists that would ensure consistent results regardless of who was conducting the mission. By the end of 2013, their program had trained over 60 personnel in extreme long-range precision shooting, with graduates going on to successful missions throughout Afghanistan and other operational theaters. The systematic approach they had developed was proving to be teachable and reliable, transforming what had been a unique individual achievement into a reproducible military capability. The technical innovations continued as well. Working with equipment manufacturers, David and Rodriguez developed improved atmospheric monitoring systems, specialized ammunition designed for extreme long-range performance, and scope systems that incorporated ballistic computers directly into the optics. Each advancement made extreme long-range shooting more reliable and accessible to properly trained personnel. In March 2014, David received news that brought the long-term implications of his work into sharp focus. A graduate of their program had successfully engaged a target at 4,200 meters in Afghanistan, breaking the record that David had set just 18 months earlier. The success validated everything they had been working toward: proof that their methods could be taught and replicated by other people. "It's strange," David told Rodriguez as they reviewed the mission report from the new record shot. "I thought I'd feel disappointed that our record was broken, but actually I'm proud that someone we trained was able to push the boundaries even further." Rodriguez nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "That's what makes this more than just individual achievement. We've created something that can grow and improve beyond what either of us could accomplish alone." The program continued to expand throughout 2014 and 2015 with advanced courses, specialized equipment development, and operational deployments that consistently demonstrated the value of extreme long-range precision shooting capabilities. David found himself traveling frequently to provide training and consultation for units preparing for complex missions. By 2016, 4 years after his original record-breaking shot, David had been promoted to Master Sergeant and was leading a program that had fundamentally changed how the military approached certain types of tactical challenges. The question Captain Sullivan had asked about making an impossible shot had evolved into an entirely new military specialty. Looking back on his transformation from weapons technician to program leader, David often reflected on how a single moment of decision had completely altered the trajectory of his career. The willingness to attempt something that seemed impossible had opened doors and created opportunities that he never could have anticipated. The program's success had also validated his fundamental belief in the power of systematic technical preparation. Every calculation, every equipment modification, every hour spent studying ballistics had contributed to achievements that continued to push the boundaries of what was considered possible. Rodriguez, now a sergeant first class and recognized expert in ballistic data analysis, had developed atmospheric monitoring and calculation techniques that were being adopted by military forces from allied nations. Her systematic approach to measuring and predicting environmental factors had become essential to success in extreme long-range engagements. "David," she said during one of their regular program review meetings, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you had said no when Captain Sullivan asked you about that impossible shot?" It was a question David had considered many times. "I think about it regularly. That single decision point changed everything, not just for us, but for everyone who has benefited from the capabilities we've developed." The weapons technician who had been asked about an impossible 3,820-meter shot had become the architect of a program that had redefined what was possible in military precision shooting. The question that had seemed so challenging in September 2012 had become the foundation for innovations that continued to evolve and expand. As David looked toward the future, he knew that the program would continue growing and developing long after his own involvement ended. The systematic approach they had created for solving impossible problems would inspire new generations of soldiers to push beyond conventional limitations and achieve things that had previously been considered impossible. The impossible shot had indeed changed everything, but more importantly, it had proven that with proper preparation, technical expertise, and determination, the boundaries of what was possible could always be pushed just a little bit further. The question Captain Sullivan had asked that morning in 2012 had become the starting point for a journey that continued to unfold in ways that none of them could have imagined.